I wrote a book for really little kids because it's just not an intervention that's been made yet, to help them understand that these technologies work well for specific people for a reason. And when you encounter a selfie filter that deforms your face and distorts it into something that like feels weird and makes you feel bad about yourself, to not internalize that and to understand why in the historical arc you are in that moment.
I'm joined today by Dr. Avriel Epps. Avriel, thank you for being on Urgent Futures.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited.
I am too. I guess to kick off, because there's so much juicy specifics that we'll get to, if you could share a little bit about your practice and we'll go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a computational social scientist. I'm trained as a developmental scientist as well as a data scientist. So my work is really kind of across computer science and developmental science. And I'm mostly interested in questions around artificial intelligence and how it impacts the people that interact with it, and kind of these human algorithm behavior feedback loops that happen. And in that, I think my research is really focused on like understanding and diagnosing what happens in those interactions. But then there's this like emerging thing in my life now where I'm trying to think about how we can create different ways of interacting with algorithms, different ways of building them, imagining development that happens like in community and through kind of an abolitionist lens. And really all of that's motivated by my care for future generations and like really wanting to make as much of a positive impact on this world as possible for my kid and, you know, his peers and the kids that'll come after.
Would you say that you had an inclination that way or an impulse that way your whole life? Were there like inciting incidents or sort of clarifying incidents that sort of like created that that sense of commitment or accountability to the future?
Maybe, but I think what first comes to mind when you ask that question is so much of people's research, at least like folks who have historically been kept out of the academy, is really me search. And I think a lot of me search ends up being focused on like the thing that has most traumatized you in your life, probably. For me, that was adolescence. Like adolescence was a period for me that there was a lot of painful experiences. And so when I first was introduced to research as a concept in undergrad at UCLA, I was thinking about, you know, my adolescence and how I could make better, how I could better understand the experiences of my adolescence through like the structural forces at play there. Because as I was going through it, I was just thinking, what's wrong with me? What's happening in this world that like makes this so difficult for me? But when I got to college, I was like, oh wait, there are like histories and institutions and cultural norms at play here that shaped the difficulties of my adolescence. And so that's when I started to try to unpack them a little bit. But as somebody born in the 90s, the internet was like such a huge part of my adolescence and such a huge opportunity to explore different identities and experiment with different identities. For me, this is like MySpace and learning HTML for the first time and learning how to like code and customize my profile and then upload my art and connect with people I didn't know. And I was making music at the time. This is like a little tangent, but I was making music at the time, and in like formal music industry spaces, being told, "Well, you look a certain way, you play this instrument, which is the piano. Like you're the next Alicia Keys," and me being like, "Well, I don't feel like that's like the path that my art is really taking." And so I would make weird experimental music and put it up on MySpace, and like people would fuck with it. And so like that was kind of the first time of being like, whoa, the internet is this like really cool place. But also it exposed me to so many opportunities for abuse, like so many stranger danger moments that I didn't have anyone in my life who like knew how to help me navigate those things. And so, yeah, when I got the opportunity to do research, my first thing was like, well, let me think about how the internet shapes what the music industry thinks is valuable, and like how Black artists are engaging different forms of Black art beyond just like these like urban pop kind of labels. And that was the beginning of my research career. So,
Wow.
yeah.
So, because I knew that at one point you had done some work with Spotify, but I didn't realize that that was rooted in your own music practice. Before, I want to ask about the Spotify experience, but do you still have access to the music you were making on MySpace back in the day?
I have the tracks. They're not on MySpace anymore. I don't even know if you can access my MySpace profile or anyone's MySpace profile right now. But in doing that research and in undergrad, I also started writing an album in college that was dealing with all of the themes around critical race theory and gender studies and all the psychology stuff I was learning. And I put that out after I graduated. So that's still on SoundCloud, I think.
Cool.
Yeah, you can find it if you're curious. It comes along with a little booklet where I like write a like analysis of all of the songs as well through that lens. So.
Very cool. Yeah, and I see a lot of seeds of like stuff we'll get to later in the conversation there. But yeah, talk to me about what it was like, because Spotify is a big beast. In the definitely, we're recording this at the very end of 2024, and there have been some revelations about where Daniel Ek is investing his money that are quite complicated. What was your experience like working? Well, I guess the first question I should ask is, what were you doing there? And then what was your experience like?
Yeah, that's a good question. So that research that I was talking about from undergrad actually got me invited to a conference, and I presented, and somebody from Spotify was in the audience. And I should say that first set of research questions I was asking were, are there something along the lines of, are there more expansive opportunities for Black identity in the context of rap music happening online versus the stuff that's being pushed by traditional media? And that was before streaming was like being counted for the Billboard charts and those kinds of things. And then when I got to Spotify, at that point, I had already started thinking about algorithmic bias, these like kind of systematic errors that computational systems make that privilege and disadvantage historically privileged or disadvantaged groups. And luckily, one of the lead researchers at Spotify at the time, Henriette Kramer, was also interested in questions around gender bias in Spotify's algorithms. So the project that I worked on was trying to understand how different users experienced gender biases in Spotify's recommendation algorithms. And a second question I had asked was, does that differ across the demographics of the users? So do users of different age groups, are they like more influenced by biases in the recommendation algorithm in terms of like their later future listening based on like their developmental stage, right? Like, is there something about your brain being in a certain, or your psyche being in a certain place in development that makes you more or less susceptible to these environmental algorithmic inputs. And so that was really interesting. And the answer to that question was yes. We also were just trying to catalog like, what is the representation of non-male artists across these different listening environments? And does that match up with also the supply of artists that are on the platform? Because one of the things about algorithmic bias is that it mostly exists because society has been biased, and all the data we've collected about society contains those biases. And that definitely was the case for Spotify. Like, women have historically been excluded from the music industry, and so and non-binary people have been invisibilized in the music industry. And so it makes sense that the algorithms would recommend fewer women and non-binary artists, right? So yeah, it was really just trying to understand a little bit more nuance. Like, they knew that there were gender biases, but they hadn't asked some of these kind of just like deeper questions about it. Mm-hmm.
And, I understand you might not be able to talk specifically about what actions Spotify may have taken, but like, let's zoom out broadly. a lot of people acknowledge that algorithmic bias exists. But I think the next step for a lot of people is sort of like, well, what do we do about it if bias exists in society? So I want to throw that question to you. What are some steps that you recommend people start considering upon encountering the reality of algorithmic bias and the underlying fact that algorithmic bias reflects systemic social bias?
Yeah, I think those are kind of two related but separate questions, because there are lots of proposed actions that developers take or like machine learning engineers take to reduce bias. A lot of that has to do with curating your data sets better, right? Yes, of course, like there are biases in data, but also like we have so much data. And so you can better curate the training data to reflect the world that you want it to reflect, as well as the testing data. And other things like, choosing what your optimization metrics are going to be. Like, what are you going to optimize for? Are you going to optimize for accuracy, like making sure that the model is perfectly reflecting the world that is harmful or like not working well for everybody? Or are you going to optimize some other metric that's important to you, like equity or justice, or like some transformed version of the current reality that you want to optimize for? And so with all of those various recommendations, like the field of fair and accountable and transparent and ethical algorithms is like rapidly growing, right? So there is no shortage of reports and white papers and guidelines for developers to follow. The problem is that the incentive structure for them to follow those things doesn't quite exist yet. And there is a huge gap, I think, between like research and practice in computer science, and this huge gap between academia and industry when it comes to these specific questions about justice and equity and inclusion and diversity and all of those beautiful things. Yeah. Of course, there's not that big of a gap when you're thinking about like how academia and industry work together for more nefarious goals. But
I think this nicely segues into talking about digital justice. And I love that so much of your scholarship, but also your public output, has to do with how these topics relate to particularly young people in the real world. Because one thing that I observe happens a lot is a lot of really wonderful scholarship is generated and only encountered by other scholars who can, read academic ease. And so let's start there with what is digital justice? And then I have a lot of questions from there.
Whoa, what is digital justice? I don't think I've ever had to formally define that on like in a conversation with somebody. But for me, I think it has to do with a few different things. The first is making sure that everyone who's impacted by digital technologies has power in how those digital technologies are created, deployed, tested, refined, et cetera, et cetera. So like one could say that a massive digital injustice is the fact that so many of us, in fact, probably all of us in this society at least, have contributed the raw materials to create artificial intelligence, which has created massive wealth or massive value for investors, and hasn't done any of that for those of us like who, for who the technology would not exist if it weren't for us, if that makes sense. And then another piece of it is that, like, does the technology reflect the world that we want to see, that we are striving for, that we are progressing toward, versus the one that currently exists, which I think most people could look around, regardless of what side of the ideological binary or spectrum you exist on, could look around and say, like, we could do better than this. You might disagree on who the marginalized people are in the society and who deserves justice in the society. But I think it's pretty clear that we live in a pretty unequal society. And that's reflected in our technology, where there's a tiny group of people who control what technology gets built, how that wealth is generated, extracted, and then like repurposed. in that ecosystem, and then like how people's concerns are kind of like pushed to the wayside or excluded in that.
Yeah, there's this funny thing that happens where because of the way globalization and mass broadcast happened in advance of digital infrastructure, there's this techno-determinist way of thinking about our tools and our platforms just being like the weather. Like it's just how it is. There's nothing I individually can do about it.
Or my favorite, if I don't build it, someone else is going to build it.
Well, let's talk about this because I don't know where this goes exactly.
Okay.
But the kind of like transhumanist bent on like, we must build the torment nexus because if we don't build the torment nexus, somebody else is going to build it. It just instantly feels so morally bankrupt to me as a way of operating, but so many people buy it or seem to buy it. And so like, yeah, what is your take on that?
My take is your take. I think you just like no notes. I mean, I think it's rooted in a domination culture, a white supremacist culture that says that like, if we don't dominate, others will dominate us. And I don't think all humans across human existence, across cultures have felt that way. That feels to me like a unique, like colonial, post-colonial mindset. It's certainly not an indigenous mindset, like where we see all of us connected to one another, right? I would say like that feels like the root of it. And then it's also like just deeply rooted in fear and distrust of the other, which again, like individualism, like a colonial white supremacist patriarchy says that like, I have to prevent violence by being violent. And like, that certainly does not make sense to me. And I couldn't tell you why it makes sense to so many other people other than that's been the dominant culture that we live in for so long. And it is like so many people's programming that they don't get opportunities to reflect and dissect and challenge that in their lives. I mean, even like I have spent so much time of my life kind of deconstructing the ways that I embody some of these values and am in a constant daily practice and struggle of not feeding into them. And I mean, I'm somebody who thinks a lot about this and has been thinking a lot about this for many years. So I can't even imagine what it would be like for the folks in the tech industry, the majority of whom have not confronted that type of like white supremacist patriarchal violence in their personal lives. And like that for me in adolescence was kind of like the birthing moment of me even thinking about these things. I'm like, why is this so painful? Like, and so if you've never had to like contend with that in your life, cause like things have worked out for you pretty well, like enough to get you into Silicon Valley and, that it makes sense that you wouldn't really be considering that on a daily basis. Like really again, where is the incentive structure for folks to do that work? It doesn't exist. In fact, the opposite exists, right? So
surely this is some of what you're trying to address through AI for Abolition. So what is AI for Abolition?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think I was introduced to abolition in grad school as like a way of thinking about the world. First, thinking mostly about the abolition of prisons and what prisons represent in our society and how they are an extension of chattel slavery, and getting the opportunity to meet folks who were incarcerated and formerly incarcerated and could articulate this like really clear critique of the system, which then made me think about my own family members who have been incarcerated or have experienced kind of state violence in that way, and think about like just how implicated I am in that, because I don't know, for some reason I spent a lot of my life feeling like I'm so far away from all of this, but then there was a moment where I was like, whoa, I'm actually not really that far away from all of this stuff. So anyway, that's how I arrive at abolition as a theory. And continue to learn more, talk to more folks like Patrice Cullors. One of the beautiful things about going to Harvard is that you get access to folks like Angela Davis, and you get to, talk to them, and learning that abolition is not really just about the destruction of or the dismantling of carceral systems like the prison industrial complex, like policing in America, but it is also the practice of imagining and holding on to and working toward an alternative future. And so I think that is where technology and abolition are kind of like natural bedmates, right? Because part of my training in computer science is like, how do we invent the new future? Not in a techno-optimist way for me, at least, not in a techno-deterministic way either. But I started kind of circling around this question of, well, in this abolitionist future that we are working toward, where everyone's basic needs are being taken care of and met, and we have we have mechanisms for collective care and mutual aid, we no longer play into these carceral state violent systems, right? Is there a place for math, code, algorithms in that world? And one of the answers I came to in that journey, you're going to walk with me here a little bit, was like, I don't know, like the algorithmic systems as they currently exist are pretty carceral, right? Like so many of them are used to punish people, for example. Also, like there is that natural connection between data collection and like predicting human behavior and systems of policing, or parole and probation, or, bail setting, all of those ways that we know algorithms are, all of those systems that we know algorithms are working in and are being biased in as well, right? So at first I was like, well, the master's tools are not going to dismantle the master's house. So no, there's no role for technology in this future. And then I came to this point where I was like, I actually don't believe that math and code and algorithms are the master's tools. Computer science as we currently experience it, absolutely like of this society. But these like truths about like numbers and like predicting patterns, that no like group of people has ownership over that. And so like I don't yet have any answers about how AI can be used in an abolitionist context. I have theories and I'm like running experiments right now. But it's something that I'm really curious about, especially because the thing that we need, the thing that abolitionists particularly need is an alternative vision that could work at scale. Because the current scale of carcerality is massive, right? It's not just the prison industrial complex, which is massive. It's not just policing, which is massive. It's the military industrial complex, which is also massive. It is the impending ecological threats that will make it so folks can't get their basic needs met, and so many will perish. And so I'm not ready to accept that there's no role for the scale of big data and computation in trying to solve for some of these problems, which are so massively, or which are existing at such a massive scale.
God, I hope you're right.
Me too. I could be so wrong, though.
Well, I mean, one thing that I come back to a lot, I mean, I mentioned this to you before, but like my entry into tech was through the early this go around in 2014, the virtual and augmented reality scene. And a lot of the framing of that technology at that time was as the solution to what was broken about existing technologies. And so I got to witness the few ways in which I observed that to be true. But over time, it was kind of the wool being pulled from your eyes of like, oh, there are so many ways in which it only reinstantiates whatever was not working or harming people. When I try to distill like what is technology. And I don't mean this in kind of like a willfully ignorant way, but like we think of it through the lens of like electronics and computer science. Like that's our frame for thinking about technology. But if you go back to the original root word of techne, it's making. And the impulse to make, I don't view that as a wrong thing.
Absolutely.
I don't view that as an inherently harmful thing. Of course, there's the classic thing of like a hammer can be used for, you know, building or for violence. And so if that's the root that you're starting from, I can, you know, we have a history that demonstrates time and time again the good that can come from that impulse. I mean, we're having a conversation using symbolic language right now, and like none of that would be happening if there wasn't this sort of interaction of our tool making capabilities and our, you know, communication capabilities and attention sharing capabilities. So at that very zoomed out, from that very zoomed out view, I can say, okay, so tech is not wrong, like capital W wrong in all cases, because there are instances and ways that I think that way of engaging with the world is good. You know, like all caveats on the word good and, you know, whatever. Anyway, thinking about the work you're trying to do, I guess the first question that comes to mind for me is, are you observing any particular examples or frameworks or even just encounters, hypotheses in the research that you're doing for places where, big data in particular, AI in particular, computing in particular, could lead to liberatory pro-social outcomes and kind of live into the good possibilities of what technology could be?
Yeah, I think there are lots of cool examples of folks trying to do this. So I want to just, before I go into these examples, I have a big caveat, which is that the resource intensity of computation right now, like for me, feels like the biggest hurdle we have to get over before I can say like, yes, we can use technology like toward pro-social aims, because of the climate crisis that we're in and the rate at which we're stripping resources from the earth and not regenerating or renewing them, and how big data systems are exacerbating that. That for me is just like the first thing I just can't get over. So if we have to put that to the side before I can let my imagination kind of let us look to the future. Whatever's going to happen in the future that gets us past that moment, or that set of constraints, seemingly intractable constraints. One of the most often proposed alternatives to the criminal legal system, is like transformative justice. So these community-based pods where folks support each other when interpersonal violence happens or conflict happens. So you don't have to call somebody who doesn't exist in your community and doesn't understand the social fabric that you're interacting with, that person having a gun and handcuffs or whatever, come in and help kind of mediate and decide what justice will be, right? I've participated in several transformative justice processes, and it has really changed me. And part of the transformative justice is that it transforms the individuals that are going through the process as well, and they become vectors for transformation in all the other spaces that they inhabit. One of the issues with transformative justice, and I spent this year talking to so many restorative and transformative justice practitioners, RJ and TJ, is that it's often marginalized women, victim survivors of really harmful acts that are called to do this work. And it takes an immense emotional labor to hold space for folks in a community in a way that is like compassionate and sees their full humanity. I think the depth of that labor and like the difficulty of doing that is one of the reasons why we don't see this happen at scale. It's so much easier for someone to sit up on a pedestal in like a special outfit that deems them as separate from everybody else to look objectively at the facts and determine like what justice is supposed to be. It just like takes less energy. Like it literally probably burns fewer calories. You know what I mean? I mean, that's not a scientific fact, so I don't know if that's true, but it probably does. And so one of the things that we've been talking to this community of TJ and RJ facilitators about is like, how can we reduce that emotional, the burden of that emotional labor? Or if the emotional labor is the thing that computation cannot replicate in any capacity, how do you free up more cognitive resources to be able to hold that emotional space for folks? And I think that there are some things that computation can do to free up those human beings, cognitive resources to do transformative justice work. The problem there is like, can we get computational resources that the TJ and the RJ folks trust to like engage with? And like another problem is like basic stuff like data security and data privacy. If you're talking about super sensitive things, do we want a computer listening to those conversations, listening and collecting data about those things? But anyway, that's like a space that we're experimenting in now. Part of what we hear from folks also is that they desire a digital asynchronous space to share resources with each other and be in community with other practitioners and like share stories and learn from one another, which like, that's why social media is so successful, because that's what it allows folks to do on some level. But they don't want to do it on these corporate controlled channels. And they want to have more ownership over their data. So there are kind of like simple things that, like simple technological tools that can be built to help this group of people who do this abolitionist work. And they're just like not a target demographic that any big tech company or even small tech startup is probably that interested in serving. And I think that's one of the interventions that we are trying to do at AI for Abolition is like, well, how can we build technology with communities, not for them, right? And involve them in every step of the development process, give them governance and ownership over all pieces of that technology, figure out how they want to share it with other people in the world. And just like that's the experiment, right? And there are lots of tech nonprofits, open source projects, of course, that do similar things, but not necessarily for like the same political goals of reducing our need to engage in like the prison industrial complex. I don't know if I answered your question, but
it was great.
Okay, cool.
No, the question was just kind of around examples you've seen, but I think you got at the heart of the question, which actually comes back to this thing that Meredith Broussard and so many other people sort of highlight, which is like techno-chauvinism is not like de facto. We can't solve social problems with technical tools all the time in every case.
Absolutely.
There might be a technology that aids in social responses to social problems. But the assumption that the technologies will sort of do the trick is in itself part of the problem.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think about the example that I often use is like, can we use computation? Or let's talk about artificial intelligence specifically. Can we use artificial intelligence to build the scaffolding for new ways of doing things so that we can then move human resources and human capital away from these systems that we see are failing us into new ways of being? And then once we're in these new ways of being, we can start to take away some of that scaffolding. I don't think that there are probably some examples that disprove what I'm about to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. I don't believe in this idea that we need to always be creating technology to take to take over the things that humans are naturally doing. I think we're always going to run into problems when we do that. We saw it with like the Industrial Revolution. We're, like one could make the argument that like all the technology we've developed for agriculture has gotten us to this terrible place where we have no more topsoil and like all the watersheds are poisoned. Like, so anyway, my way of thinking about development has been about like, if we're trying to build a world that does not exist yet, can we use technology to prototype that really quickly and then like get everybody resourced and trained up and skilled to go move into that and then take the robots' jobs? You know what I mean? So for this transformative justice example, like not enough people practice TJ. And we know that there's so much good evidence that restorative justice works really well. And so we just need to get more people who understand how to practice restorative and or transformative justice. So can we use technology to like skill people up really quickly, and then we won't need the technology anymore because folks will know how to handle conflict really well in their communities,
And there's a cool like Trojan horse quality to like using the shiny bauble of the technology.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
1,000%. Yes. I mean, I have this conversation with folks in my community on my team often. Like, all the TJ practitioners that we talk to, they're like so under-resourced. And then I'm like, well, is there a way that like we know that folks are going to give money to like tech projects, and then can we just like use that to resource these people? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's something unfortunately very sexy about AI that's not sexy about like the slow work of building community.
Right. Well, that's not a quick fix. That's not like
Right.
a quick little fix. And also one thing that I've spent a ton of time thinking about and continue to think about is, under modernity, particularly post-industrial revolution, we have this notion of progress looking and feeling a certain way. And particularly with the 20th century being this, these leaps in advancement. I mean, it was 100 years ago that we discovered the universe was expanding. Like that's how much has happened. And that's how sort of brain splitting the 20th century was for people. That I think it created this almost like steroidal approach to what progress is, which is like these major leaps compressed into these tiny time frames.
Yep.
So there's the question of like, is increasing growth in GDP progress? There's like that
Right.
question mark.
No.
Then there's within that, right. And then within that, there's like, is the frame where it has to be massive and scaled and all this stuff, is that actually progress?
Right.
Question mark.
Right.
And then there's the follow-up question, and I know you've spoken about this, so I respond to this however you want.
Yeah.
Of like, people don't want to regress. But then actually a lot of what people are scared of regressing to are actually things that would, as the research shows, make them much happier. Like being in community with people in analog spaces, regenerative agriculture. Somebody used this term the other day, and I asked who coined it, and they said, well, it's very common in the indigenous Hawaiian community. So I'm throwing the credit that way, but inevitably somebody will tell me that there's like a specific person that said this. But they have a kind of pun of new innovation, but KNEW, to basically say like all these things like regenerative agriculture. It's like, that's what people did for millennia before industrial agriculture. So then just thinking about the shiny tech bauble, it's like, and getting back to an earlier comment you had made around the master's tools, which I run up against that phrase all the time. And I love the way that you kind of reframed like mathematics and code as not necessarily being the master's tools per se, because there is a way you can look at it and say like, well, it's all the master's tools. And if it's all the master's tools, then we're just never dismantling the master's house, which is not a belief set that I want to hold dear, even though I understand the deep wisdom in that quote. And so it's like, how do we start to work from within the context we're in, have an imagination of what the ideal would be, even if the ideal involves regress, and start to move toward that in this way that is having to kind of hold these ideas in tension, where maybe it's almost like I'll speak for myself. Like sometimes I feel sort of like hypocritical, or like, am I pandering if I'm like talking to artists who are using AI in like really exciting, revelatory ways? But then in my head, I know, like to your point, like, oh, but all that energy that got used up, like, was it worth it? And not knowing necessarily how to square that in my mind. So anyway, that's my like big response to you. And I guess I'll just see what rises up.
Okay. I have so many thoughts that are like all my brain's doing the ADHD thing. Okay. The first thing I want to say is, like, to the point of regression, like, I think as a society, we do need to regress. I've thought that ever since I read Sex at Dawn, which is like, I don't know, it's like a polyamorous like text. And I was like, dang, they're really making a strong argument as anthropologists, and that like we really need to go back to like hunter-gatherer societies. I like that everyone would be so much happier. And then like, yeah, there's so much recent discovery about how indigenous communities have better, like simple things, like just better microbiomes in their gut, you know, like, which now we know, again, we have discovered that plays such an important role in so many biological processes. And I will also say that becoming a capital S scientist and getting trained in that lineage at a, you know, institution like Harvard, I think maybe potentially I could be like completely unaware of my, you know, blind spots and how I've been programmed by that institution. I probably am unaware of a lot of my blind spots, but that's why they're blind spots anyway. But I think what it did for me was to get to that point that you just made, that we're like not really just like positivist and post-positivist scientific paradigms are not discovering anything new. They're just colonizing like all of the inherent wisdom that so many societies for so long had figured out already. And also like just inherent wisdom that each of us can tap into in ourselves. There's like, you know, a fine line, and this is why it's hard to be a social scientist too, I think. But I think this is true in so many of the like earth sciences and like physics and biology, like, but in social science specifically, every paper I read, I'm usually like, yeah, no, duh. Like, you got published because you were the one who put it down on paper, you know, which is like, cool, that's great. We need to like document these things. But like, so much of that is actually just documentation. It's not really discovery. And it's documentation in like a very specific like language and like communication pattern for this society, not necessarily like transferable or generalizable to like all of humanity. So I struggle with that, like being part of the scientific community and like knowing that to be true. I absolutely fantasize about just like saying fuck all this shit. Like I know that I need to just be like playing in the dirt and hanging out with my loved ones and like, you know, bartering for the things that I can't grow on my own. Like I feel deep in my soul that that's actually what I'm truly supposed to be doing in this lifetime. But this goes back to like, what are the incentive structures? Like, there's no incentive structure for me to do that. And in fact, there's like a disincentive structure for me to do that. It's like so difficult to reorient your life that way. And also, like, I know when we had talked about this before, and you talked about Bill Reese and his way of thinking about this, like, I'm not so naive to think that the solution is just for all 9 billion of us to like go live in communes. Like, I don't think that that's like what needs to happen either. And so I just keep coming back to like these problems feel pretty intractable given how everything is set up. And what is that? What is that capitalist realism? That like capital, like I can like imagine the end of the world before I can imagine the end of this political economic system. Like that makes me so sad. But anyway.
Well, I mean, the part that gives me hope on that front is neoliberal economics is like 70 years old. It's not
such a good point.
It was new. It was a bunch of dudes' idea. And, you know, it obviously had some things going for it because it's an incredibly attractive, you know, political economy for wealthy people. But it also does speak to the fact that these types of ideas, if they gain enough traction, things can change. It's that kind of like slow then fast way of thinking where it's like, it can feel like it's like, wow, no progress is being made, and then bam, it happens. And this was documented, you know, for instance, with gay marriage, but it's happened in a number of different categories. So the maybe glimmer of hope that I hold on to is like, if you're doing work like this and you're connecting to other folks who are doing similar work and there's starting to be a groundswell and a different way of approaching, like, you know, you're approaching this from the perspective, among other things, as a scientist, and there's a lot of really major change you can precipitate from within the sciences as a scientist that a non-scientist couldn't. But then somebody else who's working in another framework or paradigm. And I think that there's, I've observed anecdotally, and I observe it in myself, a lot of kind of like, waking up sounds like I'm valorizing it, but it's more like catching up to what has been obvious and then like just sort of having this like step back moment of like, oh shit. And so to your point, like, yeah, it reminds me of there's this meme that's taking the moment from Return of the King from Lord of the Rings, where Frodo's saying like, I wish it had not happened in my time. And Gandalf says something really flowery. And the meme just says like, LMAO, well, it did. And that's kind of how I feel when I sort of think through what my doing my me search on my future is like, wow, there's so many things that like, I think I'm like built for, and only a small subset of those feel like something that the world actually needs. And a lot of those feel not very fun. And so like acknowledging that, like, if I want to be like living by my values, that there's like a narrower band of things that I have to focus my energies on, even if they fail. But I'm just observing more and more people kind of feeling that way. I mean, climate crisis, yes, but also like everything we've witnessed over the past year, geopolitically, at politics at home. Yeah. There's just a lot of wool has been pulled off a lot of people's eyes.
Totally. Yeah. I think that's true. And I think we can thank technology for that in a lot of ways. I was at a screening for this film called The YouTube Effect. And I was on a panel with the director of that film, and they were talking about like just kind of the exponential growth curve of like content that had been uploaded to YouTube. And I was like, yeah, that curve and the curve of people getting involved in social movements, like those are related to each other. Not to be Jonathan Haidt and like put two lines next to each other and be like, there's a relationship there. But I won't publish that in the book. But also no shade to that man. But I think that is also, again, going back to my adolescence and like these questions being started on like, oh, this is an interesting experience I'm having on social media. No one around me can help me navigate it. Like neoliberal economics is 70 years old, like social media is 20 years old. So like we don't yet have the spaciousness from it to like disentangle all of the good things and the bad things to be able to make such like strong claims that technology on the whole is like really fucking us up. Because I think and also I'm sorry for cussing so much on your podcast. Fine. Okay, cool. I think that what was set in motion by the rise or by the turn of industrialization was going to happen regardless. And then what was set in motion, or like how that was put on steroids by neoliberal policies was going to happen regardless of if we all were watching it on social media or not. So part of me feels a little bit of hopefulness and like gratitude, which is such a weird thing for me to say about social media, that like we're all able to witness it. And I do think that there's the potential for that still to have an impact on how things turn out in the future. Please, folks watching this podcast, do not read that as like a techno-optimist take on social media connecting us all and saving the world. But there is something to be said about us having some collective experiences globally when we're facing these global existential crises.
Well, I feel like this is a good time to shift to some of your research, particularly around identity formation, but also just like how you're observing young people's relationship with technology impacting them. I mean, you brought up Jonathan Haidt, who's kind of the maybe figurehead of a particular way of thinking about social media's impact on young people. I've seen some things you've posted that were kind of putting some question marks on that. Not Jonathan Haidt particularly, but kind of from your earlier point of like, there's a lot of underlying systems and incentives that social media is overlaying.
Yeah.
Where there hasn't necessarily been great research disentangling those contexts.
Right.
So anyway, throwing to you, like, what's the state of identity formation and the impact of tech on young people right now?
Yeah, I think generally we can appreciate that social media as it currently exists, and the incentive structures underneath it, which are just to create as much value for shareholders as possible, doesn't serve any of us really that well. The technological innovation of people connecting with each other asynchronously when they're not in the same room with each other, and then also the serendipitous nature of algorithms where they can expose you to ways of being and thinking that you wouldn't otherwise be exposed to in your immediate environment. I would want to see those things preserved with the downfall of big tech. I'm not quite sure how we do that, but I think those things are valuable for young people and for marginalized young people. So like, let's take COSA, for example, the Kids Online Safety Act. I am in community with folks who feel like COSA is a really good step forward for kids' online safety. And I know children who worked on getting that, who worked on getting that through. And still there is the question about like, what about a lot of the controversy around that was like, what about the kids who are more marginalized? The kids for whom they need to have access to these online communities. They need to have access to information that they wouldn't have access to locally. What about them? And I think that's like a really important thing we have to keep in mind when we're talking about the harms of social media. Because for some kids, the harms of not having access to online communities and information are greater than the potential harms of what we think are like the general harms of social media. Increased mental health problems, exposure to like eating disordered behavior, right? That kind of stuff. So a lot of my research in thinking about how does algorithmic bias and development, identity development specifically, kind of work with each other or like are influenced by each other, has been focused on the like marginalized groups of kids who like these mainstream narratives about how the internet is harming our kids are like not paying attention to. And some of the interesting things that I found is that there are a lot of sources of resilience for kids online. And also there are a lot of unique harms that are not documented or are not given like the same kind of importance because it's harms that only impact Black kids or harms that only impact queer kids. So I think like that is, to give you a non-answer, that is kind of like the messiness that I'm sitting in, the tension that I'm holding in this conversation about children and social media specifically. It's really, I don't think it's that simple. And anyone who's trying to sell like simple solutions, I'm always just like, I don't know, right? Anyway, I'll leave it there and we can.
Hopefully we can.
Yeah, we'll get back to it. Yeah.
Well, on the subject of examples, just for folks who might not, be spending time with this literature or these ideas, are there some examples of those unique harms that you could describe?
Absolutely. Yeah. So one of the things I researched for my dissertation was looking at augmented reality selfie filters on social media, and the like larger mainstream conversation we're having about selfie filters is like about like eating disorders and like unrealistic standards of beauty. Is this like driving young girls to want to get plastic surgery, which I think all of those are valid concerns and they deserve inquiry. But the question I wanted to understand was, there have been like fewer, but still some reports of things like the bold glamour filter on TikTok, like whitewashing people's features. And I was like, okay, well, does that impact kids of color who interact with these filters? And then if it does, are there like forms of resilience that these kids have or can acquire or can develop in themselves that would buffer them against those negative impacts? And so the answer to both those questions is yes. When Black children interact with, this is under review right now too, so I don't know, maybe a peer reviewer will disagree with me and then I'll have to retract this podcast. But when Black children interact with selfie filters that change their features to be more European, it is predictive of experiencing anxiety that same day. And that's not a causal relationship. We don't necessarily know what direction that relationship goes in. And also, we know that for the kids who are engaged in ethnic racial identity development, learning more about their history and culture, like learning about historical figures that have been Black that have made a positive impact on society, having conversations with family members, things like that, then those effects are mitigated. So I think it's interesting because so much of the conversation about kids and social media has been like, it's bad. They are victims to this like predatory industry, which they are. And also, I'm so interested in like, okay, what is the asset-based narrative that we can tell here about these kids who like, maybe because I was born in the 90s, have a little bit of this, but like most folks don't understand the like well of resilience or like the internal like competencies that kids these days need to have. Kids these days need to have to navigate this world. Like there have to be strengths and like new ways of coping with this that we could be researching and then like promoting and helping them to develop, absent like the dismantling of like predatory technological industry.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think that's where also the inspiration for writing a kid's book really comes out of for me. Because I do think that, and I think a lot of the research that comes out of the, what does CELDTech stand for? I'm just going to say the research that comes out of Brendisha Tynes' lab at University of Southern California talks about, they're like critical literacies, critical digital literacies that kids can develop really helps them. It like we can kind of neutralize some of these negative things that everyone is afraid of if we just give them language and frameworks and like historical understanding of why we are in the moment that we're in, they can cope better. And so anyway, I wrote a book for really little kids because it's just not an intervention that's been made yet, to help them understand that these technologies work well for specific people for a reason. And when you encounter a selfie filter that deforms your face and distorts it into something that like feels weird and makes you feel bad about yourself, to not internalize that and to understand why in the historical arc you are in that moment. That feels really important to me. And, you know, I truly wrote it for my kid, but I'm also, you know, I wrote it for myself too. Like these are the things that I wish I had known when I was a little girl, so that when I got to adolescence, I didn't internalize it. And then I didn't have to spend the next 20 years of my life in therapy.
Well, the world being what it is, we all probably would have ended up in therapy.
No,
regardless.
totally fair.
I think this is a good moment. You brought up the book. I'd love if you could share the title of the book. But then also, how did you go about, like, I know what your conceptual goals for the book were, but how did you depict it? And I guess, like, was your kid a kind of like alpha tester of the book to see if there was, like, you know, if you were messaging correctly?
Yeah, that's a fun question. So the book is called A Kid's Book About AI Bias. It is very much like no nonsense, nonfiction, and I'm going to talk to you like you're fully capable of understanding these complex ideas. And I'll use language at a level that is accessible for folks who read at a second grade reading level, which was also doing a children's book, I think was intentional for me, because I know that so many of my deeply respected colleagues and mentors who write books around algorithmic injustice, Meredith Broussard, Sophia Noble, Joy Buolamwini, et cetera, the average American doesn't read at a college level. So it is a kid's book. And also I think it's for the parents who are reading the kids' book along with their kids. It is a book meant to be read in conversation between grown-up and kid. And it is my hope that more folks will feel like they can engage in conversations around algorithmic injustice, because they can read a 60-page primer written at a second grade reading level and be like, oh, okay, cool. Yeah, I get it. Like, I can go on the internet now and critique the algorithms and, like, you know, what they're feeding me. And I will say that, like, it's interesting that this is coming out at this moment, because I actually do feel like most lay people have, like, a pretty solid understanding of how algorithmic systems work and how they might be harmful. I'm doing a lot of interviews for another qualitative research project that isn't about transformative justice, but is about Black and Jewish folks and thinking about Israel and Palestine. And part of that research is understanding how their online interactions with content and other humans are shaping their views about the conflict, and also like the American conflict that's happening over the conflict in the Middle East and the genocide. And when asking those research participants, what are their like lay theories about the algorithms and what they're feeding them, most of them have a pretty good understanding. I will say that the common critique that I hear, or the common refrain that like points to a critical framework for thinking about algorithms, is that like, well, it's a profit motive. Like everything that I'm seeing is just being driven by profit, which again, pretty good understanding. The mechanisms for how we get from biased data, trains model is biased, I feel like there's some more work that we could do there in raising kind of like public awareness and like a general consciousness around that. And then also, folks feel pretty defeatist about our technological reality. I think like lay people, when I talk to them, are like, oh, there's not really much I can do about it. I don't have a lot of power in this situation, which like on the surface is true. But one of the arguments I try to make in the kids' book is that these systems don't exist without us, without our data, and therefore we do have power. We could all collectively decide tomorrow that we are going to stop, we're going to stop feeding, or we're going to stop uploading data, or we're going to turn our locations off, and we're not going to take our phones with us when we go run activities throughout the city or whatever. Like there are ways we could protest and essentially strike against the data labor that we're all performing at any given time in the day, and reclaim our collective power. We're watching this labor moment that we're in right now. We're watching people do that all the time. There's literally no reason why it wouldn't be possible for the folks who produce the raw materials that power artificial intelligence systems to do that as well.
Well, also it's like these things, like it exists on a spectrum. So like, obviously the messaging around personal responsibility, like most embodied by, I believe it was either Chevron or Exxon. I think it was Chevron, essentially like invented recycling. And the idea of personal responsibility and your carbon footprint was weaponized to then have a populace not seeking systems change, but I gotta. So I never want to fall into that danger.
Right.
To your point, on the other hand, there are ways actually that we can reclaim our sovereignty in these moments that might purely be performative now. But if more and more and more and more people start doing that, it starts to become like, it might still be performative, but it starts to have actual impact. And so, yeah, you don't bring your phone on a run, and then you tell other people that you're doing that, like, oh yeah. And a lot of people start doing that. And then all of a sudden, like the data for, maps algorithm starts to suffer, or like these things can start to have impacts that you can't foresee, which makes it worth thinking about. What are those ways that like scale from the easiest to the hardest? Like I'm thinking about this a lot right now in terms of energy use. Like I, shamefully, I'm not somebody who unplugs things when I'm not using them. Like I leave my phone charger plugged in by my bedside, and I have I don't need to do that. So starting to think about like, I could just unplug it, like, and then plug it back in when I need it, and then I'm using less energy. That's an extremely easy thing compared to, committing to biking around Los Angeles,
Right.
rather than driving, which is something that I ultimately would love to get to, but feels very distant to me right now. And so like thinking about how that applies in an algorithmic context feels really rich for me, because like all of a sudden you're like, oh yeah, I don't need to do that. I don't need to do that. And like, I know you did a video where you declined to have your face scanned at the airport, simple steps that add 1 minute in position to your life that maybe if a lot of people start doing them have major impacts.
Yeah. I mean, the facial recognition technology at the airport, the opting out thing is like such a good example, because it's so performative, but it is such a good muscle to build. Like it's scary to do that. The first time I did it, I was very scared. I'm not going to lie. And there's this like government official who's grumpy, checking your passport. You don't want to like make their day worse. Usually it's like a woman of color. And I'm like, I'm sorry, sis, but I'm like, you know what I mean? Like, and also like that is a muscle that needs to be built across a bunch of different like everyday actions, so that when like a moment like what's happening in South Korea now happens, you can be ready to look a military officer in the face and be like, put your weapons down. Like, we're not doing this. You know what I mean? So I see those opportunities, as you said, as like just exercise. It's like, doing your 10 push-ups in the morning or whatever to like get you ready, go on your 1 mile run so that you can be ready for the, marathon. Yeah. And I think the other thing I want to add to that is it feels important to instill that in children, because like earlier is better for building those muscles, especially because they do not know of a world where this technology doesn't exist. They literally have no framework or conception for what the world was like before the internet. And each of us can like look back and hold on to that a little bit and be like, things are getting a little weird. my 5-year-old doesn't have that. He's not going to have that. And it's going to be like this weird nostalgia thing that his parents talk about, like old people. But like, if we don't like have these conversations with him about this is how we got to this place, and we should be curious about and also critical of the things that don't feel like they affirm your full humanity.
I feel like there's more that I want to know about the book. I mean, inevitably, folks should just go buy the book.
Yes, buy the book, March 11th. Buy it anywhere books are sold. My favorite bookstore is Rep Club here in Los Angeles, so go buy it by a Black woman-owned bookstore if you can, but anywhere is good.
Amazing.
Yeah.
You had mentioned how there is a certain canniness and a certain understanding among this generation who have only ever grown up, under algocracy. But that there are still some gaps that sort of need connecting. Are there any other examples like that you'd highlight from the book of what you were trying to kind of like draw out or share, especially as it might relate to a children and parent, in the course of reading the book together?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, naturally I start the conversation in the book talking about selfie filters on social media because that just felt like such an easy entry point. And it's like, you interact with AI. Honestly, for me, it was because that was like the first way my kid and I ever interacted with AI together, I think. He just thought it was so hilarious to turn his face into a dinosaur on my phone. And so like, I would let him do it and we would sit there and it was fun. Anyway, so that's kind of the first moment. But then the other major point that I wanted folks to walk away from after reading is that so often AI systems are invisibilized. It is the diagnostic algorithm that your doctor is using when you come in to see them. And like, maybe they tell your parent, hey, by the way, like this is going to get run through, a machine learning algorithm and it's going to tell us if you have cancer or not. But like, you might not fully know that that's happening. It is the algorithms that your police department might use to decide which parts of the neighborhood that they're going to patrol. So like it determines whether or not you see police on your street that day. It increasingly will be what schools use for admissions, what jobs what employers use to decide who they hire. But these things are not usually communicated in a forthright way and they're obscured. And so I wanted to point out a few of those examples so that kids could know that they're interacting with algorithms even when they're not directly interacting with them on the internet.
Amazing. Can't wait to see it.
Yeah, thanks.
You briefly touched on the Bridging Histories research project. What is that?
Yeah. So after October 7th, 2023, the attacks on Israel on October 7th, and then the resulting attacks on Gaza, October 8th and after, we were all experiencing it. There's a lot of really hard stuff going on. And I found myself feeling very disturbed and sad about the way that conversations just devolved into camps and like empathy for the human beings who were being directly impacted was like not being freely shared. In my dissertation, I studied Black Lives Matter as like a social movement that impacted Black teens via algorithmic systems. And some BLM chapters had posted really offensive memes. And also there were Jewish family members of mine who were like, fuck the protesters at campus. Like they're all it was just like, I'm living in crazy town right now. Like how are people like not holding on to nuance in this moment? And maybe in real life, people were holding on to nuance. I felt like when I was in real life, the like vitriol and the hatred and the like not being willing to like see other people's humanity wasn't happening as much. It really felt like an online phenomenon. And also I felt so glued to my screen at the time too, because the images of what was happening were so disturbing that like you couldn't really look away from them. Eventually so many of us probably did, saw an image that was just like so disturbing that I had to put my phone down. I was like crying for a whole day. I was like, I can't believe I just saw that. Anyway, and I really saw this like rift happen between my like community that was Black and my community that was Jewish, just being like, we're not on the same page about this. And like anti-Black racism started increasing and like anti-Semitism started increasing. And then like, obviously what was happening to Palestinians was so horrifying. It felt like we needed to have more in real life conversations, and that might be a point of intervention for like the vortex of just like doom and hatred that was going on online. So the Skirball Community Center at here in Los Angeles and Patrisse Cullors decided to put on a 12-month-long dialogue series with Black community members and Jewish community members to try to intervene. Like, I think there is a history. It is not the complete history, but there is a history of Black and Jewish solidarity in this country in the 20th and 21st century. And that felt like it was being really tested. And Patrisse came to me and was like, do you think the internet's playing a role in this? I was like, yeah, absolutely. And I was like, if you do this dialogue series and you should research it. You should see like, does this make a measurable difference in how folks feel toward each other, the solidarity that is there? And also selfishly, I was like, and do you think, and let's see if it also maybe is like impacting their algorithmic recommendations or their behavior online, and there's a relationship maybe between their online behavior and their algorithmic recommendations. So yeah, in a nutshell, it's an intergroup dialogue kind of intervention, a pretty classic intergroup dialogue intervention, but has this additional layer to it that is looking at how in real life intergroup dialogue may impact or be influenced by algorithmic systems that folks are interacting with outside of the times where they're dialoguing. Yeah.
And so you're about halfway through that?
Yep, we are. It's interesting. It's a mixed method study too. So we've been doing like deep interviews with all of the participants, part of which have informed the study design. So in that way, it's a participatory research project as well. Doing longitudinal kind of survey research to understand some of the psychological constructs that we're interested in, like feelings of solidarity, belongingness, safety in the group and across groups. And then the final piece is analyzing the data from the social media that each of the participants interacts with, and trying to then see what patterns there emerge in what's happening online, but also how that relates back to the other types of data that we're collecting as well.
I know that it's obviously not done, so everything is kind of, there's an asterisk on it, but have you observed anything or any insights materializing that have surprised you?
I knew folks were gonna feel a lot of feelings about participating in something like this because the stakes felt really high, like end of 2023, beginning of 2024. Folks were losing their jobs, they were like losing their livelihoods over having any kind of opinion, getting canceled. Like, that's neither here nor there. But so I guess like I'm not surprised when I say this, but it also is kind of surprising that there is a bit of a hesitancy on the part of some of the participants to like open up their social media data. Like, that feels really vulnerable to them. So like, it's not surprising for the ways I just mentioned, but it is surprising because in my mind, I'm like, anybody could buy that data. So like, maybe not like you, I mean, they could target you specifically in so many ways. And also like they have bought it in the aggregate from so like, I like maybe one day I'll do a study on like the psychology of data donations, like internet data donations. And because that part is really interesting to me. It's like these companies already have this data. Like, why wouldn't you want researchers to use it? Maybe there's also, sorry, now I'm just like thinking about future research projects, but like maybe there's something else that's happened in like the medical literature for folks who like donate their organs to science or like whatever. Like there's some psychology there that I'm unaware of, but that part has been really interesting to me. Like when they're like, oh, I don't know, I haven't decided if I'm going to donate my data. I'm like, totally no pressure. Like that's totally cool. Like, and also if you like the ethics of the project are that if you decide later that you have donated your data and you want me to delete it, I will. Like that feels very important, but it's just interesting to me.
Yeah. I mean, it gets a little bit to your point that you were bringing up earlier around how not only the tech, but the kind of machinations of how people use the information associated with the tech being invisibilized, where I think a lot of people, even if they ambiently know that their data is being monetized, maybe don't understand. Maybe if they were confronted with the sheer variety of sort of fingerprinting and sale of their data that were happening all the time, then the donating the data to a researcher might not feel. It certainly wouldn't feel as like this standout, like, ooh.
Right.
So that's kind of my guess,
yeah.
maybe is like, because you're actually trying to do it the ethically sound way rather than just sort of scooping it behind the scenes, which is what's happening to them.
You know, this is interesting because we were just talking about like opting out of facial recognition tech at the airport. And I was like, that's performative. I know that it's performative. And those are the reasons why I know it's performative. Like my face exists in so many databases already. And like the active resistance there for me is the consent piece. It is like, I want to feel like in every interaction when I give over my biometrics that I'm able to meaningfully consent in that process. And that has been like a really important piece for this research project in particular, but I think for the way I conduct research in general is like, are these consent practices like central to the study design and the protocol? So yeah, we'll see. We'll see how many people actually decide to do it. And if we replicate the study somewhere else, if folks will do it then too. And my theory for this is that like they know me, and like for some people that makes them feel way more comfortable. Like, okay, I trust Avriel; she's going to handle my data well. For other people, they're like, but she knows who I am as a person. It's not just some like anonymous thing, like which like I'm going to anonymize the data anyway, and I explain that to them anyway. So It's interesting.
It's like when you have to give a talk, but then you want to practice it with your loved ones, and you're like, I'm actually way more nervous about practicing with my loved ones than,
exactly
than delivering it to strangers.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, this segues kind of nicely into thinking about the different hats you wear as a public communicator and as a scientist. Because I'm guessing that maybe some of the reasons that people are aware of you is you have, a bunch of content that people are able to either they've encountered on their own, or if they want to know more about you, they can quickly get a sense of like who you are and what matters to you because you've been really thoughtful in what you've shared, in this field. How do you, I guess, let's start with the kind of broad question of like, how do you negotiate the very distinct demands of being a scientist versus a public communicator?
Such a good question. It's really difficult. I struggle with it a lot, and I will tell you why. The slow work of doing science, thinking it through as you're writing it, getting reviews, doing edits, like there's so much security in that because you know that by the time it's gone through peer review, like it's probably about as good as it can get in that moment. And of course, future studies are to continue to get it better, right? And social media moves at like such a fast pace. And like just the like simple constraints of like a 90-second TikTok versus a 30-page journal article, you're just like never gonna make anybody happy when you're doing that kind of when you're making that kind of intervention. And I felt like it was an important intervention to start making, though, because when ChatGPT came out and GPT-4 came out, like my timelines were just filled with tech bros talking about, okay, this is how you're going to use it to optimize this, and this is the prompt that you're going to use, and like that still totally exists. And then there was also like the higher level conversation that folks were having around like, you know, like a larger like strategic conversation of like, okay, well, where is computer science going as a field, and blah blah blah. All of that was like fine and interesting and entertaining. And it felt like there weren't enough people just like asking if this was the right direction that we should be going in, given the long, like, you know, decades long history of inquiry around tech harms. Like that is not a new field. Like this is not a new field. This is like a really well established, not really well, but it's an established, you know, field. And I was like, wait, what happened to like all the good journalism that was happening about like why is that not filtering into the TikToks? And of course it is, but I was just like, it's just not enough of it. Like there's not enough balance. So yeah, it felt in the same way that I'm trying to make an intervention by writing a kid's book at a very kind of like specific reading level. I think there's like a similar desire in me to simplify and memify some of these things that I study, so that there are just like more points of access and entrance into the deeper conversation that we need to be having about what role should technology really be playing in our society.
I'm interested by this idea of intentionally, like a lot of people criticize memes for compressing nuance.
Mm-hmm.
And those are valid critiques.
Everything I've ever posted has suppressed and compressed nuance. So,
well, so talk to me about your creative process then, because like inevitably you're trying to, it's sort of a hook. It's sort of like, this actually isn't the point. I'm trying to drive attention to the nuance, but you're having to use this nuance compressed format to do it. So how do you go about doing that?
I think that's the reason why I'm not an influencer also, is because like it's not creating social media content for the sake of creating social media content, which like it is creating social media content for the sake of getting folks interested in diving into kind of like the longer form media. And I think that's what you do. Like it's a lot of people do this, right? So, but sorry, the question that you asked was, what is your creative process? And my creative process is, if I feel outraged by something, I know somebody else will feel outraged by something. And I also know that the science says that outrage is what hooks people on social media. And so if I can like figure out a way to use that mindfully in a way that feels ethical to then like point folks to other references, like I'm going to just experiment with it. I don't feel fully comfortable that I'm doing this well yet. And I've been wanting for months now to make some content that explains the psychology behind how specific hooks like work to keep you engaged, and how me knowing that is the reason why I've been able to replicate virality, and like what the implications of that are for like our collective psychology, and how that ties into the all of the stuff that folks talk about with like social media not being healthy for young people. And like I am like knowingly participating in that toward a different end. And again, I don't know if I'm doing it well, or if I'm like, if the benefits outweigh the costs yet. So I'm just experimenting. And every time I upload a video, I make myself feel a little bit better by saying, this is just another data point. Like, one day you can write a paper about this and you'll like create some beneficial output for society beyond just making people mad. And yeah, and then I continue on.
Yeah, but I mean, it kind of comes back to your earlier point of like, there's so much good, maybe latent, maybe realized, of people being able to, not to use the hackneyed kind of connect, but connect to ideas that they wouldn't have encountered in other ways. So, from my perspective, obviously, like ultimately, like circuitously, that's how I even found your work. So I can attest to it, like from my own life. I have nothing to contribute on the subject of like, from a broader standpoint, does it sort of justify itself? But I think that we have to hold open the space for experimentation, because we're kind of in like an everything in the kitchen sink moment with both technology and, broader questions of overshoot, polycrisis, collapse.
Yeah.
There might be right answers, but we don't necessarily know them out of the gate. So we got to just kind of throw the spaghetti on the wall and see what sticks.
And like, sometimes I wonder though, because part of my justification is like, if I'm not making content, then somebody else is. And like, but that goes back to literally the first thing we were talking about. Like, if I don't build the killer robot, somebody else will. So like, I don't know. I mean, this is also when I really lean into like queer theory of like again, maybe it's my neurospiciness, maybe it's just the society that I've grown up in, but like, it's so easy to get in these like binaries of like, I either do this entirely or I don't do it at all. And, if there's either a right answer or there's a wrong answer. And part of my like political, spiritual, like, personal self-growth practice is like really trying to recognize when I'm existing in these tensions and just like hold the tension. And eventually, sometimes an insight emerges and then I can act. But I don't want to be reactionary and say like, well, I know that there's 1, 2, 3 things wrong with making this type of content, so I'm just going to like not do it. I want to sit with the tension a little while longer before I decide what I'm going to do next.
I really appreciate that. Staying with that trouble. I also want to +1 the idea of doing a kind of like breakdown from like a decision science standpoint, why these hooks work. Like, I selfishly want to understand that so I can be a more literate consumer of this type of content. Are there any examples that come to mind that you could share here of like, here's this hook and here's why it works from a psychological level? I know I'm sort of putting you on the spot. So if
I could just give examples from my own feed, honestly.
Right.
Like, I did not want to speak, I am not somebody who studies like AI in like military uses or like defense uses of AI. It's something I'm like tangentially interested in and sometimes read about. But I also knew like that was the thing everyone was thinking about for like so many months. Since many people have since moved on, unfortunately. And so I was like, okay, how do I connect AI ethics to this thing that everyone is thinking about? I mean, it's like, you're a journalist. It's like the basic thing that journalists do. Like, you have to know what the lead is and like how it connects to, relevant current events. And so that is definitely something, but I know that there was so much emotional arousal around the violence that we were seeing that like there was an intervention to be made there and say like, okay, this also like all of these things are connected, and let's channel some of that emotional arousal into like critiquing another system that is not the one that everyone is like really thinking a lot about. The other thing is like, folks don't want to feel left out. So I often start a lot of my content with like, did you know? Because like folks want to know the thing that another person knows that they didn't know, you know? And so like sometimes it's just really basic and simple. And then the good and bad thing about technology is that we have so many terrifying pop culture references that we can make. So any time I can like invoke, is it invoke or evoke? I think it's
Well,
invoke.
either, depending, yeah.
Yeah. Anytime I can invoke like Minority Report or Terminator or something like that, but then be like, actually, we're going to go in this direction instead, like that typically gets people's attention. And the reason I know that is because I spent a lot of time with like my partner's cousins who are just like, they're just dudes. Like, you know, they're just like, when ChatGPT came out, they were like, oh, this is so crazy. It's making me, you think we're going to have Terminator soon? Like, they were really like, they were going there. And I was like, oh, interesting. That's what people who are like not thinking about this every day like I am, like that's where their brain goes. And so then I was like, okay, I need to think about that a little bit more deeply and then see how it translates to like talking to a mass general audience.
I saw, speaking of these style videos, I encountered a video that has really stayed with me recently, which was somebody talking about, and we've done a terrible job of this, I hate to inform you today, who was basically arguing that folks on the left, he was like, the average American reads at a sixth grade reading level. So you either need to use, if you're going to use big words, small sentences.
Right.
Small
I saw
words,
that
big
one.
sentences. Yeah. And I was like, God, it's so right. And it's like, man, I need to implement that better. But I hadn't, been thinking in that mode.
Yeah. I think that is where I really appreciate true community organizers. And I'm lucky to be in community with like several like boots on the ground, like have been trained for decades as like door knocking community organizers. And unfortunately, baby internet leftists don't quite have the same training and the same thinking. And they tend to dominate the airspace on social media. And so what they think counts as like leftist community organizing is like not actually rooted in the reality that like you have to meet people where they're at, you have to use the language that they're using, and you have to figure out what it matters to them and then like start there. That was the other thing about just this last 14 months of watching all this violence on my screen from coming out of Israel and Palestine and the surrounding countries now was like, folks really thought that just like shouting down people who didn't understand where they were coming from was going to like change anybody's mind. Like, I think post-election now, we can all agree that that is not a good strategy. It's not going to get us where we want to go. And like, there's no moral superiority in like not willing to like empathize with the human being that doesn't hold the same exact belief system as you.
There's a phrase that a friend of mine who's actually been on the show, Britton Heller, used many years ago that has always stayed with me, which is that she had never seen somebody convinced by being told all the ways that they're different, but it's being shown all the ways you're the same. And like that really does not feel like how a lot of discourse on social media works from an outrage standpoint. Like establishing commonality with a perceived outgroup is usually shot down. And this gets very touchy, of course, because there's bad actors on social media as well.
Yes.
And so trying to ameliorate bad actors, trying to like draw a bridge to people who are not operating in good faith, that can be a problematic and even dangerous thing. And those people can be doing and perpetuating dangerous and potentially violent ideologies or actions. But then there's the, like, when we're talking about what's happened in Gaza, and as you said now is unfortunately unfurling into a broader regional campaign, is that there've been a lot of people who I've heard from back channel who are either experiencing anti-Semitism or who are perceiving it elsewhere and feel like they don't have an avenue where that can be acknowledged. And of course, I completely understand and am sympathetic to the counterpoint that anti-Semitism is being used as cloud cover for a lot of geopolitical ambitions on the part of Likud and on the part of Bibi Netanyahu, to conduct, slaughter. And so it's like these things can both be true. But if we can meet each other in a place of good faith, like, let's start to try to talk it through. I mean, it's sort of hilarious to even be, we're across an ocean, but like really doing the like hard, complicated work that sometimes social media doesn't allow. I guess maybe my like long-winded way of kind of coming back to your work with bridging histories is like, do you see any things working through social media, or are the solutions where we can have that nuance and hold multiple realities being true at once, are those exclusively analog? Like, can that only happen in physical spaces?
Yes, to both of those things. I think the first part of like what's working on social media is your critique cannot, if you're going to levy a critique on a TikTok or a reel or a YouTube video, it cannot be of whole groups of people even individuals, like, except for if those individuals are like heads of state, heads of corporations, like people who hold the like immense power and are like representatives for the institutions that they are in charge of. And so even when I'm posting rage bait, which I will admit I knowingly do, it is never like, oh my God, can you believe that this, group of people did this thing? It's never that. It is like, let's hold big tech accountable. Let's hold the military accountable. Let's hold polluters accountable. Like it is very clear in the power analysis and being critical of the imbalance of power. The human beings are not ever the equation or the people to be blamed, nor are the human beings like wholly responsible for, like individually responsible for like making some kind of change or actualize some kind of change. Like we have collective responsibility and we need to build collective power to deal with the imbalance of institutional power. But so that's the first thing, is that I think that there can be an intervention made on social media if you are clear about and can articulate your power analysis. Second piece of that is that when it comes down to changing individuals' minds about something that they are personally implicated by, it has to be an analog process. Like maybe there are scenarios where individuals can be introduced to an idea that is slightly different from an idea they already hold, but takes them in a direction that starts them moving somewhere else. That happens online, I think. But ultimately, it is finding a community of other people that you can have conversations with about the ideas that you're discovering for yourself that like helps you embody a new set of values. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And the difference is that we are so feel so much exasperation about when we witness them another, like when we are made aware that like people we care about or people that we're like proximal to like have that like exasperation and channeling that like toward that person is literally never going to change their mind, especially if it happens on social media, because it's too easy to just be like, boop, I'm done. So again, this goes back to like the tension and like being able to like hold and stay in uncomfortability the being able to build that muscle of doing that is like a central skill set I've witnessed for the kind of community organizing that we always talk about wanting to see happen, of like bringing people together, galvanizing them toward a specific aim, mobilizing them to achieve that aim. Like that requires us to like not just be comfortable and feeling like we're better because we have better ideas or whatever it is that makes you feel superior. And ultimately, like that is also white supremacy, by the way. Right? Like being like, I am better than this person because I know more words or I have more theories or whatever, and they don't understand. Like you're just replicating the exact same thing. At least if you're on the left, you're replicating the exact same thing that you say that you're opposed to.
One of the critiques that Jonathan Haidt makes is that being on social media robs children of the ability to develop conflict resolution skills. And like, meaning like his argument is that if you're out in the world, you have to, if you do something that hurts somebody, you see that it hurts them and you learn in these particular ways. I'm wondering if, given what we've talked about, that you have a different perspective on that.
I think there's definitely the potential for spending an excessive amount of time on social media to like lessen your ability to deal with conflict, certainly synchronously, because if you're dealing with conflict on social media, it's always asynchronous. I would say that culturally, though, we've had a problem with conflict resolution for far longer than social media has existed. And the main critique I have of the anxious generation is that it purports to take some like socio-historical frame and look at the issue of the increased rates of mental health problems in young people. But it is a really narrow socio-historical framework that does not take into consideration so many of the well-researched like contributions to how our society is the way it is today. It feels very surface level. And I think if someone were to write that book again, but through the lens of queer theory or through the lens of critical theory, they would say, yeah, maybe they would say, yes, we are observing these things, but the hypotheses for why, or the conclusions that he draws for why we see those things would be less simple than it's the internet. I mean, there's I think it's like an early chapter in that book where he says like, some people may argue that like children are dealing with the polycrisis. He doesn't call it the polycrisis, but like children are aware of war, genocide, climate change, rising inequality. And then he kind of like waves his hand and says, but in so many words, is like, but they wouldn't know about those things if it wasn't for social media. And in the past, we've had wars and it's actually galvanized people. It's galvanized young people. It's given them something to believe in. And I'm like, which people? Because like, if you're going to point to a recent war, you want to point to the Vietnam War and say galvanized, like, first of all, that's not necessarily true. Like, look at the massive like anti-war movement that came out of that. But then also like, that's talking from a very specific standpoint. You're talking about maybe like some patriotic, probably white, probably male folks who were like positively impacted by said war. What about like all of Vietnamese people? You know what I mean? Like, it's just not expansive enough of an analysis for me. Let alone like methodologically, there's like a lot of questions to be answered about how do you take these things that are correlated and then like make these like quasi-causal claims about them. Like that part, just like from a methodological standpoint, I think is like what most people who critique the book kind of go to. But I also think he just makes a lot of assumptions about which teenagers we're talking about. And he doesn't outright say which teenagers he's talking about. And that's a problem. Like, if you go back and read that book and you tell yourself, oh, he's talking about white middle class teenagers, then a lot of the claims make sense. But like my brain can't do that. Like I have to be like, well, what about all of the other kids who are like, you're clearly not taking into consideration here. So I don't know if I don't even remember what the original question was.
Oh, I mean, no, I'm so glad we went where we went. The original question, I was the line of inquiry I had in my mind is like, are there new problem solving skills and new conflict resolution skills that might be emerging on? Well, I didn't really, though I sort of framed it in the inverse of like, he frames it as like, you only develop those in analog spaces and social media robs you of the ability to develop those. I guess my follow-up question then becomes like, in your research, whether the sort of, proper buttoned up qualitative research you're doing, or in your anecdotal research as a human being, as a parent, as a family member, do you see there being any ways that people have used social media to develop new and ideally beneficial conflict resolution or problem solving capabilities or traits?
Maybe not directly on social media. I think like that is still probably not happening. But I will say, like, anecdotally in my life, social media has led to opportunities for like deep conflict resolution processes that otherwise would not have happened. I'm thinking specifically about a conflict, an experience I had as a young person that I wasn't able to fully like analyze and process until I was in my 20s, late 20s, and then like processed out loud on social media. And then, I don't know, like 5 years later, had somehow like made its way to the person that I was like, in conflict with at that time. And then their community, and then we all got to sit down and have a TJ process about it in our 30s. I don't think that would have happened without social media. So that's my one anecdote of like, the other thing, like, I don't disagree with that assertion that like spending too much time on social media robs us of opportunities to interact in real life. I think that's like a no-duh. But thinking as an abolitionist, as somebody who believes that like no human beings are disposable and everyone is capable of repair and reconciliation and growth and transformation, I will say that has been an easier concept for me to grasp, given that I'm able to watch people's lives unfold over time, even when I'm not in like direct communication with them. So I think there's something to be explored there. That's like my first time really thinking about that. But there is something about social media that has allowed me to like have a more expansive understanding of like who human beings are, who they can be in different contexts, when different identities are being highlighted and others are being suppressed. There's a complexity there that like, if I was just hearing like through the grapevine what so-and-so was up to and I hadn't seen them in 15 years, I don't think I would have that same depth of understanding or or empathy for them.
Yeah, it's like kind of the positive side of parasociality. And just to clarify, I'm not meaning to like box you into being like a social media booster. It's more that like we're so inundated with all of the ways that social media is toxic, and most of which I'm amenable to.
Same.
But what I was sort of gravitating to was this comment you had made earlier related to how social media has like emerged in a particular context. And so there's that context which, facilitates certain ways of interacting that then are being expressed on social media because social media re-expresses those incentive structures. But to your point about, math and code not per se being the master's tools, there's probably an equivalent argument to be made about social media where like a social media platform not predicated on, invasively extracting user data and in, feeding algorithmic content to you, casino style, with your swipe down and scroll up. Like there's probably some platonic ideal of a pro-social social media that if we just knee jerk are constantly like, oh, social media is bad, we might kind of miss the opportunity for it. So that's what was in my head as I've been trying to kind of ask those questions because I recognize how close you are to these issues.
I think that's the right way to think about it. That is as we are working toward dismantling harmful systems, we also need to be thinking about what's going to replace them. And like, maybe not every aspect of big tech is replaceable or needs to be replaced, but we do need to be thinking very deeply about that because at least in the camp of researchers that I exist in, it is like diagnose, destroy, diagnose, dismantle, and that is just like the constant, which like, again, I don't disagree with. And also like, what's next? What are we proposing? I mean, Ruha Benjamin does like an excellent job laying this out in Imagination or Imagine, a manifesto. And I agree with her. I think like as an individual, I'm fully capable of continuing to diagnose and like and do what I can to divest from these systems. And also that's kind of boring to only be doing that. It's depressing. It's like not fun. I'm a creative being. You're like we are all creative beings. Like I also want to feel like I am involved in the project of creation at the same time. And that feels like deeply important for like validating my own humanity too, as like not somebody who was just put here to like point at everything that hurts everybody and like, I don't know. I have like Wreck-It Ralph in my head right now. Like, just like, just go around trying to like destroy everything. It's also nobody wants to be a part of that movement. It's another reason why the left is kind of losing right now because it's just not fun. So like and I learned this from the TJ and the RJ practitioners I've been interviewing, like the joy is in the creativity. It's in the creation. It's in the like making of things. And like, we have to make this movement joyful if we want folks to participate in it and to not just replicate the same things that we are fighting against.
I love that.
Yeah.
Do you still make music? What are your creative outlets?
I have done some musical stuff recently. I performed as part of one of Patrice's like performance art pieces at the Broad last year. So I sang as like a partner show. That was really fun. My friends can get me to like sing, but like nobody else can. I'm still deeply traumatized by the music industry. And so I don't know if I'll ever like go back in a studio and like do that thing. Although I had like ideas that I'd want to test out, but I'm so busy right now too doing this work that like it feels hard to. Right now all of my creative energy is actually going into like this a communal land project that like I and some like friends and family have found ourselves in, and I'm just like deep in learning about like watershed restoration, and I like the kind of like building I want to do is like earthworks. So that's like, I think somehow that's artistic too in my mind, but
Absolutely.
yeah.
Can you share more about that? And maybe it's
That feels a little too personal to
okay.
share
Yeah,
about.
yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
No, totally. But I'm glad to hear that that exists for you, because that sounds really special.
Yeah, thanks.
I know you also have a somatic practice, like in like thinking about all of this like really heavy abstract stuff. And I think a lot of people like they might not necessarily be as close to it as you are, but they have that sense that we're kind of in a quote dark timeline. And so I think there's no shortage of people who are wondering like, how do I deal with this as an individual? So I'd love to kind of throw to you, like, how do you deal with all of this as a person, as a being?
Yeah. Part of that practice. So yeah, I do have like a somatic practice, and it's really like somatic experiencing for like dealing with PTSD. And one thing that I learned about myself somewhat recently is that like the intellectual thing that we're doing right here is like a coping mechanism to like not feel what's happening in my body, because I feel often like very unsafe being in this body, which makes sense. I'm a Black woman living in America, Black queer woman living in America. So a lot of the somatic work I've been doing is just like, honestly, so much of it has just been like recognizing and that I'm in a body, and that I'm not just like a brain floating around in the world, like doing this like mental, intellectual work all the time. That sounds so simple, but like when I like heard that, and then later when it actually clicked for me, it felt very revolutionary, because the experience that my body is having is like more closely connected with like the environment, nature, other human beings, I think, than like this place that's like not actually embodied, but is just like thoughts and like up here in like the thought space. If that makes any sense. And what I was missing out on in being in the like intellectual space all the time, in addition to it like contributing to massive anxiety, was like not actually feeling and processing and watching how my body naturally processes emotions. There's something really weird that happens if you ever do somatic experiencing, when like you realize that your uncomfortable emotions, the feelings that are actually in your body, like your heart pounding or your like tummy feeling like there's butterflies in it or whatever, that like that uncomfortable body sensation goes away pretty quickly as soon as you like recognize and validate it. It's like if you like keep trying to think about something else, and I also learned this being a parent and like being deep in like respectful, like gentle parenting land too. But like if you keep trying to like distract yourself and not focus on the emotion, it just stays. It just like lingers back there, and your body never fully processes it. But if you like pay attention to your body metabolizing the emotion and you like validate it, then it goes away like relatively quickly. That was also like pretty mind-blowing for me. So the question that you asked was like, how do you deal with like thinking about the doomer stuff that you think about? It's actually like the thinking about the doomer stuff I think about is like a coping mechanism for like not being connected to my body. And that, and ultimately is also like the antidote to like connecting back to my body, connecting back to nature, seeing how we are all part of nature, and how like these indigenous wisdoms, as we were talking about earlier, about how like all of these things are connected, is like ultimately where I find like regulation and like stability.
Amazing. There's so much more that we could talk about, but that feels like the perfect place to kind of like close that conversation. I have 3 questions I like to ask every guest.
Go for it.
And so feel free to call in things that you've brought up already, go in different places, whatever feels good. What is one thing you wish people paid more attention to?
I think the thing I wish people paid more attention to is the like inherent power that children have. They like, I truly believe that like if children were like the lawmakers and the leaders in this world, that like we would be in a way better place right now. Yeah, more folks really don't pay attention to the wisdom of children. We just assume they don't have wisdom because they haven't lived a lot of life. And that feels like deeply untrue to me as like somebody who studies children, but also who works with children, but also, you know, when you like learn things and then they just feel true. That is one of those things where I was like, yeah, this is not the dominant message that we get about young people, but it feels very true. To me.
I feel like I have a lot more questions on that.
Okay.
Just maybe one quick sub question is like, are there any kind of like window moments like where you where that really was pronounced for you, like a way of relating to an idea or a way of you saw kids interacting with each other?
Oh man, every day as a parent, I like all of this stuff that I just talked about around like somatic experiencing and processing. Like my kid does that so naturally. He just hasn't been like programmed out of doing that yet. I'm relearning the things that I already knew when I came out the womb. So every time I'm like, oh, I knew this at one point. I forgot it or was told something else was true and believed it. And now I have to come back around and like dig through all that stuff that was piled up on top of it. And the truth was probably there when I was 5, you know? I don't know if that's what you were asking.
No, that's absolutely right. Yeah, it's perfect. What is one resource that you use or recommend for making better sense of reality?
It's definitely not social media. I'll tell you that much. I would say like the tool of empathy. We had talked earlier about like the need to hold 2 truths at once or multiple truths at once. And I think really the only way to like, the only times I have felt like I can really grasp onto what feels real is when I allow for multiple truths to be true at one time. And like, and that requires empathy. It requires like truly believing and understanding another person's experience, even and especially when it conflicts with your own lived experience. I think that I was lucky enough to receive a kind of doctoral training that allowed me to understand many different epistemologies or several different epistemologies and know that like positivism, post-positivism is one way to understand truth. And also like people's lived experiences in asymmetrical power structures is another, like believing those stories is another way to understand what's actually true. And so many folks just by default take on a post-positivist stance, even if they can't articulate it as such, that it's difficult for folks to accept that reality and truth is actually very, very messy and not easily measured.
Boom. All right. Final question. What is one moment when your sense of reality was disrupted?
We didn't really get into this much. We kind of talked a little bit about my adolescence and then getting to undergrad and like going on a research path. Part of that like A to B journey for me was coming from a family that was multiracial and had like a very colorblind politic, and like growing up being like, oh, we're good now. Like, you know, colors of
It's
Bennington.
over.
Yeah, exactly. In my kindergarten classroom, you know? And then going to I graduated high school early, but then I was like in community college for a really long time. Didn't think I was ever actually going to go to college. Eventually, I did end up in college, and someone put up Tyrone Howard, professor of education at UCLA. He's the homie. I love him. Put up a slide in a summer program that I was in, and it was like a table of data about the demographics of students who make it through community college to undergraduate, or get a bachelor's degree, to a master's degree, to a PhD. And it was like the percentage of Black students who start at community college and get their way down to a PhD. And it was like 0.01% or something, like some like really tiny number. And he was like, there's a reason you've been in community college for 7 years. And I was like, whoa. That was what like blew my mind. I was like, oh, structures and systems play a role. This is not just me as an individual, like making my way downtown. That really opened it up for me.
Well, I'm glad it turned out the way you did. Yeah. Thank you so much for spending time with me on Argent Futures today.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you could share a little bit one more time about the book and when it will be out.
Yes. A kid's book about AI bias is out March 11th, and it's going to be sold everywhere where books are sold. So get yourself a copy. Try to buy it from an independent bookstore.
Amazing. Thank you again.
Thanks.
This podcast is edited and produced by Adam Labrie and me, Jesse Damiani. The podcast is presented by Reality Studies. You can learn more by visiting realitystudies.co. And if you appreciate the work I'm doing, please subscribe and share it with someone you think would enjoy it.